If the pandemic era has taught us anything, it's that we as people do a decidedly awful job of processing collective trauma. Unsurprisingly, wars more or less function the same way. Nihilism simmers in the background as a generation of shell-shocked warriors returns to the home front and its offices and assembly lines. Luckily for the United States, we emerged from World War II with one of the most dynamic cultural scenes in world history, thanks to our unprecedented diversity and the continuous innovation happening in the country's most marginalized communities. The world needed an answer for World War II, and America provided rock and roll, most clearly personified by Little Richard on his second album, the self-titled Little Richard. Rock and roll picked up the pieces of every other existing form of American roots music and assembled one emotional superweapon, pulling together the intense individual performance and manic energy of jazz, the chord progressions and instrumentation from blues, the vocal inflection from gospel and soul, and the songwriting structures and general philosophy from country. Put it all together and you've got something with explosive crossover appeal that just screams intensity on all levels. This album provides a prime example of the sound of early rock and roll, back in those days when the distinctions between rock and roll and R&B were the most porous and least significant. In fact, the main melodic instrument here isn't guitar, it's saxophone and piano. And as later rock and roll would spiral into all kinds of harmonic directions, here we find a strict adherence to blues harmonic traditions. And as later rock and roll would be played more straight, here we still find a strict adherence to the swing meter of blues. In the years surrounding this album's release, these melodic instruments would slowly be replaced completely by electric guitar, and that assertion of electric guitar as the melodic instrument would help rock and roll solidify its own distinct identity. Chuck Berry is often given credit for that innovation, but like a lot of things in music history, you could attribute it to a pretty wide variety of people during a span of a few years. Electric guitars accelerated an existing trend towards smaller bands, like what you would see in jazz as combos came to replace big bands. This comes from a head-on collision between less consumer dollars being spent during wartime austerity and electrification and amplification, meaning less people could make more noise, which also allowed for larger concerts on lower budgets, which was obviously appealing to the music industry. Historians still debate today as to whether rock and roll really is a fusion of blues and country, or if it's just a form of R&B that just happened to attract a white audience. Either way, it's an indisputable fact that increasingly diverse industrial cities due to the Great Migration were leading to increasingly diverse selections of records at record stores and increasingly diverse playlists at radio stations. This led insurgent record labels to see a gap in the market where they could create crossover artists, even as controversial as that concept was at the time. So with its newly white audience, a new name, and a new identity in hand, rock and roll was ready to take the world by storm, whether or not it was just a repackaging of existing R&B. Little Richard enters this story fairly early on. He was born in 1932 in Macon, Georgia. He grew up in an intensely religious household, and he got most of his early musical training through gospel music. But of course, as a young adult, he would go into the debaucherous world of R&B, where he would be known to dress in drag and sing sexual innuendos on his many grueling tours. While his songs were well known on their own, he was specifically well known for his intense stage performances, which bled over to intense instrumental performances as well, like especially on the piano. Early on, Little Richard would attract attention from the music industry and from local authorities due to his boundary-breaking concerts, which would be a foreshadowing of the civil rights movement to come. Though seating was almost always segregated at the shows, dancing was able to bring the two halves of the crowd together. This shared experience, along with Richard's unique ability to play at normally white-only venues, was able to chew away at the structure of segregation in the South as people started to realize their similarities over their differences. After only releasing a couple of albums, Little Richard took another hard pivot back into the religious life. We may never know the extent or the existence of cynicism behind this decision, but it's an indisputable fact that the record companies had taken so many royalties from Little Richard throughout his secular career that he needed a way to back out of his contracts. Because, of course, the contracts were written in such a way that his continued participation in them would leave him in further debt instead of actually generating income. So regardless of the purity of his motivations, he put down secular music and returned to gospel music and joined the ministry in 1957. Only 5 years later, in 1962, he would come back to secular music to tour Europe after that continent saw an explosion of interest in American rock and roll. There, he would meet and mentor the Beatles, who would would combine with the rest of the British invasion to really finish the job of crowding out American rock and roll from American record store shelves. On the flip side, the British invasion helped legitimize rock and roll as a persistent sound and not a fad, as it was already starting to be seen in the United States in the early 60s. But regardless of the final outcome for the trajectory of rock and roll, this crowding out made the rest of Little Richard's career a struggle. This record was recorded in 1957 and released in 1958, meaning it was recorded just before Little Richard stepped back from secular music and released just after. The release of this record more or less roughly maps on to the end of the initial explosion of popularity of American rock and roll, a high watermark which wouldn't be eclipsed until that later British invasion. As I've been kind of getting at here, the story of Little Richard and the story of this album really encapsulates the spirit of the modern United States. Now, of course, that character had been in development from all corners of the world for thousands of years, with varying degrees of influence from varying different parts of the world during that time, and varying degrees of attention being paid by the rest of the world as the country was taking shape. But I think the argument could be made pretty succinctly that rock and roll is where all of this development really clicked into place. And the timing was perfect, because like any globally traumatic event, World War II brought a tense, deafening silence in its wake. Every source of power and influence was a shell of its former self, and people were engaged in this failed roleplay of their former peacetime selves as they reintegrated with the world. This failed roleplay led to a number of trends being started here, which we see continuing into the present day, which all fold into that rock and roll Americanized spirit. For instance, we can chart a continued decline in institutional trust, or to the extent that marginalized communities didn't find trust in these institutions to begin with, we can at least say that institutions have definitely gotten less stable progressively over time. We also see a continuous decline in religiosity worldwide, especially in those countries most affected by that war. We see a continuous increase in economic individualism, and in turn, a continuous increase in corporate centralization. Really, we see a continuous decline of the collective in all forms, which broke all sorts of social conventions, both for better and for worse. For instance, wild displays of individual wealth are not seen quite as disrespectful today. But culture also generally takes a more hands-off approach to people's identities, leading to decreased bigotry across the board. Now, when I say decreased bigotry, you might start to have questions about the way the last few years have panned out, and we'll get to that later. The world would be forever scarred by this failed role-playing, but art decidedly wouldn't. People after the war found a hushed tension everywhere, everything spoken in hurried tones and sidestepping any kind of critical observation. And so, since they were unable to express themselves any other way, they turned to art to express the experience of having lived through hell. Painting became an almost purely physical act, something completely divorced from imagination or reality and reduced to mere motions of the arms and the hands. Movies took a turn towards the dark, the cynical, and the anti-hero, and music turned to rock and roll. It should come as no surprise then that when we turn this album on, we find a pure channelization of that rebellious energy. The piano is converted into a fully percussive instrument, only outlining the most rudimentary harmonies and melodies as the pure hammering of the keys takes over the instrument's responsibilities. The saxophone becomes this dopaminergic riff machine, only repeating the loudest, brashest, most catchy moments of its former self. The vocals here are almost uniformly shouted and are almost always used to give the most salacious possible messaging, and the drum is reduced to almost a machine, a means to an end of finding the backbeat and keeping that energy alive. The reality is, as much as people were trying to roleplay their former peacetime selves, no country emerges from something as traumatic as World War II without seeing its core dogmatism challenged, especially when that country has randomly stumbled into becoming the center of the world. So with all that energy pooling up behind a stagnant culture, the question emerges: where are we going? And this is where I direct your attention to the fundamental uselessness of that first wave of rock and roll. Whatever spirit would move America and the world with it through those processes I outlined earlier found its voice through rock and roll, by creating music as aimless as its own empty ambition for reshaping the world. And Little Richard, weirdly enough, almost seemed self-aware of this. Cursed with the knowledge, he would oscillate throughout his life between religiosity and debauchery, irony and sincerity. And we're at a junction today where we might finally realize where where that energy has been leading us, where we've been headed this entire time. Decades of consistent deterritorialization, of liberation and accompanying alienation, snaps into reverse all at once, in the process endorsing the most brain-dead version of authoritarianism imaginable. It's like people are suddenly getting awake to the aimlessness of this energy and are trying to right the ship all at once, only to realize that they've completely forgotten how to sail. Either way, we're being pushed straight towards an iceberg, leaving us to wonder if we ever had any other destination in mind to begin with. So that brings us to the end of the first set of 10 videos in this series. As people have kind of pointed out, these videos haven't really focused that intensely on the actual music on the albums that I'm talking about. These so far have really been a guide to music history, with the albums kind of there as supplemental reading to get people initiated into that story. But from here, things are going to be much more focused on the music itself, and the next 10 albums are going to have a lot less context behind them and a lot more focused on the actual subject matter, and we're going to be going into post-war jazz. So I appreciate people who've been liking the way the show's been going on so far. There is still going to be some history working its way into everything, of course, and some broader social theory, but for the most part, we're going to focus on music heading here on out, and we're going straight into jazz. Hope you like the show.